This episode is supported by Code Comments, an original podcast from Red Hat. You know when you're working on a project and you leave behind a small note in the code, a code comment, to help others learn what isn't clear in the code? This podcast features technologists who've been through the tough tech transitions and share how their teams survived the journey. In each episode, Red Hat's Jamie Parker recounts the behind-the-scenes stories of experienced technologists from across the industry who share what they've learned from implementing new technologies. Episodes are available anywhere you listen to podcasts and at redhat.com/code comments podcast. Search for Code Comments in your favorite podcast player, and we'll also include a link in the show notes. Our thanks to Code Comments for their support.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Arun and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And we have a fantastic pair of guests this week. We have Joe Curley and Arun Gupta over at Intel in the Open Ecosystems division. And we're going to be talking about open source software at Intel. It's been a few years since we've talked to the group over there, and they have come a long way. Super fascinating conversation, and you definitely want to stick around for that. I do have one quick announcement this week. Of course, we have Cloud News in there, the links in the show notes, and we have a ton of articles. But here lately, we have so much news, we just kind of moved away from it for a little bit. We're probably going to morph that into something new coming up in the next month or so. But one quick announcement. We have partnered with the CNCF and for KubeCon and Cloud Native Con. If you will be there in person, and if you don't already have a ticket, corporate use only, 20% off if you use the code KCNA23CC20. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's in the show notes if you need it, and would certainly love to see you there as well. So with that, I'm going to wrap that up for this week, and we're going to move on to talking to Joe and Arun.
Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the Cube community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech. Today's show is sponsored by Panoptica. Panoptica simplifies container deployment, monitoring, and security, protecting the entire application stack from build to runtime. Scalable across clusters and multi-cloud environments, Panoptica secures containers, serverless APIs, and Kubernetes with a unified view, reducing operational complexity and promoting collaboration by integrating with commonly used developer, SRE, and SecOps tools. Panoptica ensures compliance with regulatory mandates and CIS benchmarks for best practice conformity. Privacy teams can monitor API traffic and identify sensitive data while identifying open source components vulnerable to attacks that require patching. Proactively addressing security issues with Panoptica allows businesses to focus on mitigating critical risks and protecting their interest. Learn more about Panoptica today at panoptica.app. That's panoptica.app. And we're back. And Aaron, today we've got a show that I think is gonna touch on a lot of really, really interesting things. It's both sort of a combination of a company that we've followed for a long time. We've been friends with for a long time. But also we're going to dive into, both kind of a combination of, where the world's going and probably dig into a lot of things that people may not necessarily see every day, sort of behind the scenes things they see every day, but they're definitely impacted by them every day. So why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest today? Because I think we're going to dig into a bunch of things that people may not have been completely aware of, but are, like I said, impacted by the breadth of this work every single day.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually have two guests today. We have Joe Curley, VP and GM of Software Products and Ecosystem at Intel, and Arun Gupta, VP and GM for Open Ecosystems at Intel. So gentlemen, first of all, welcome to the show. And if you don't mind, give everyone a brief background. Why don't we start with you, Arun?
Absolutely. I'm super happy to be here. Hi, Arun and Brian and everybody else listening here. My name is Arun Gupta. I am the VP and GM for Open Ecosystem at Intel. I joined about a year and a half ago, and my team leads the open source strategy, communities, evangelism, all of those sort of efforts across the company. I'm super excited to be at Intel because I've for the last over 2 decades, I've only done open source work. And coming to Intel is sort of homecoming because how much Intel contributes to open source and how much storytelling it needs help with is what I'm excited about.
Fantastic. Joe?
Hi, and I'm Joe Curley. And what I do is I lead one of the things you'll find is that Intel, as Arun kind of said, it's a little bit of a secret, but we have thousands and thousands of software developers here, and we generate an enormous amount of software for the industry at all kinds of levels. The level of software that I deal with is primarily what we do and package into products for software developers, and then run compilers, libraries, what we build into runtimes in the broader ecosystem. And then the second thing I do is help enable the ecosystem to be able to get the most out of modern hardware using some of those tools and other open initiatives.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Arun, I want to start with you. We've known about you and the work you've done in Java communities. You've been heavily involved with CNCF communities over the years, but our listeners may not, like I mentioned at the top of the show, may not have as much visibility or even necessarily think of Intel as a software company or open source company, right? We're all super familiar with Intel Inside and the x86 architecture and all those sort of things. Can you give us some of the background on just how Intel's work with open ecosystems, open source has sort of evolved over time, and what are some of the impacts that developers might be seeing with the work that your teams are working on?
Absolutely. Well, I think I'm not surprised by the question that you're asking because honestly, I asked that same question to Greg Lavender when he reached out last year. And he said, that's the job I want you to fix because that's the storytelling we need to do a better job of. But really, if you think about it is, fostering an open ecosystem has been the foundation of our approach at Intel for over 2 decades. Open innovation, open platforms, horizontal competition truly offers that choice and builds trust. We believe it helps lower the complexity, improve the productivity, and does not lock you into a walled garden. It allows many different players, including Intel, to disrupt and create new markets. 3 reasons why we contribute to open source, essentially. First is our customers, who consume Intel silicon, whether it's in a data center or a cloud or a edge or a client or wherever it is, when they get that out of the box experience, they buy a Dell or a Lenovo or an AWS instance, they expect these open source projects, Kubernetes, OpenJDK, PyTorch, they would work out of the box on the Intel silicon, and they will work in an optimal manner. So that's where Intel contributes to 300 plus open source projects, just to make sure that our customers have a top-notch experience on them. Because we often come out with new instruction sets, new features, accelerators, or new features that we've introduced in the recent version of Sapphire Rapids. How do we make sure that Linux kernel is able to leverage all the instruction sets and the features and be able to run in the most optimal manner? So that's the reason we contribute to open source. We have been contributing. As a matter of fact, we are the top corporate contributor to Linux for over 15 years. We are among the top 3 contributors to PyTorch, among top 10 to Kubernetes, and same thing, top 10 to OpenJDK. These are some widely and heavily used open source projects. That's one. The second reason, which I kind of touched upon briefly, is the open ecosystem is really the fundamental for us. We believe it creates a truly horizontal platform that allows not just Intel, but creates a leveled playing ground where one vendor is not defining on how the stack is going to look like or what can you do. And then we are all blocked by what that vendor allows and permits, because we truly believe it creates that horizontal competition that offers choice and builds trust with the customer. And the third really goes back to our legacy that we have been doing for over 20 years, which in the open source world, people call this chop wood, carry water. And if you think about it, and you're going to mention this briefly, I've been on the CNCF governing board for almost more than 6 years now at this point of time. I'm also the governing board chair. I'm also on the Linux Foundation governing board. I'm also on the OpenSSF governing board. Now, in open source community, code is king, but there is a lot of effort that goes along with that king to support the king. And that work is often called as chop wood, carry water. And that is all the work that we do by being on the governing board, by paying our dues in a timely manner, by supporting a conference, by being part of the working group, by leading the working groups, by doing the project management and triage. So those are essential elements that really make the open source community thrive. And Intel is a big believer in that. And we have several positions across several foundations and several projects where we are playing that role. So really, it goes back to our legacy. This is nothing new. We have been doing this for 20 years, and Joe kind of talked about it. We need to do a better job of storytelling it.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Arun. And thank you for all of the context on the external work, because I know, at least for me, like I knew some of it was happening, but I didn't understand the scale to which it was happening. But let me ask you, wrapping it back into Intel for a second question. How does open source software kind of fit into Intel's broader software strategy overall?
It very well is a very critical part of our broader software strategy. I mean, if you think about it, I wrote a blog post on this, and the blog post really called about, we believe developers are fish and Intel is water. We are such elemental for these fishes to survive. Developers just don't know it. And thoroughly, we talk about how we are providing the right pH value. The water is the right temperature. Does it have the right potassium? Are we feeding the developers on a regular basis? I think that's really the key element. And Joe definitely has a perspective on this, on how it fits into the broader software strategy. So I would let him comment on part of that as well.
Well, I don't think I can be as poetic, Arun. I love the blog, by the way. There's another element that's just pragmatic. Our CEO, Pat Gelsinger, frequently says that in general, Intel tends to compete and win well in open ecosystems. And I think that's true, but we shouldn't be ashamed of this. We're a company. We're in business. And there's a statistic that said that 90% of all developers on a daily basis use a piece of code either written by or optimized by Intel, which is a shocking contribution. But there's a good reason for it. All that work that we're doing really just helps. We build new technology into whether it's our new CPUs, we put in a new instruction set, or we put in a new way of managing data around the system, trying to find a way to get 35 million developers to be able to use our hardware or to train them is impossible. But if you can enable an open ecosystem through scalable, valuable, portable, open methods, you can unlock greater value for developers everywhere and do it in a really, really transparent way. So we do it. There's a great reason to provide the water. I think it helps everyone, including ourselves.
Yeah, no, I think it's. Aaron and I have talked about this before, and we've had a number of companies on. I think people have a tendency to see some of the sort of surface level things that happen in open source. They go to a KubeCon, or they just go on GitHub and they download some stuff because somebody told them, like, hey, that's kind of cool. And they sort of forget that while open source is freely available, and in many cases, like, the cost of it's free, the cost of making it is by no means free, right? It takes a lot to do that. I'm curious, Joe, I kind of want to follow up on that. Like, as you're thinking about that, like you mentioned, there's Intel's a commercial entity, it's a public company. You've got, people that would like to see it be profitable and wildly profitable and other things. How do you go about thinking about investment? Not necessarily like the exact dollar amount, but do you have sort of a mindset or a philosophy you have that says how early do we make investments? How are you thinking about when to increase them because you're seeing certain trends happen? I'm curious how that thought process works.
Wow, that is a show in itself. How do we try to? So of course we do, and I think there are maybe one easy way, instead of saying how or how early, when you take a look at, you want to put a new widget into a system. Mm-hmm. We have a joke internally. What do you call 160,000 transistors that aren't enabled by great software in the industry? The answer is an inefficient space heater. And yep. And so I think that when you take a look at a potential value you want to put into the silicon, you have to think it through all the way to the final, to the final developer. And if you have this idea that like Atlas, you can carry the software ecosystem on your shoulders, it's probably foolish. What you really want to do is see, is the value you have sufficiently pervasive, and where is it in everyone's interest to turn it on, and can you do so? And then you look at all those things and you map it through end to end, and then eventually you make a decision to put something into a piece of silicon. That the interesting thing is that some of that thinking could happen 6-7 years before you see it in the marketplace. But the execution side of it probably happens in the last 2 years, and you have to think it all through at the beginning. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes less so. But yeah, there's a whole process on that.
Yeah, interesting.
So if maybe I can elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure.
One of the things Pat talks about is software-defined, hardware-enabled. We like heaters for the purpose that they serve, but we like our chips to be used as chips. So essentially, it's very much a fundamental part of our software strategy, because as we are getting these chips out, as we are making them pervasive across the compute spectrum that you're thinking about, it needs to be enabled by a software. And to Joe's point, Linux kernel community is a large community with very significant processes. And if an instruction set has to go live 3-4 years down the line, then that work of how you can build a feature, but how are you going to traverse the community dynamics? How are you going to justify that feature is needed 4 years down the line? And working with the community is going to be an essential part, so that you start that dance now, essentially. So that's one part.
Well,
I think, Brian, you mentioned,
go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was simply going to ask you that along those lines, I wanted to ask you kind of a trends you're seeing, because the most fascinating thing for me about that is, like, what are some of the trends you're seeing now that could impact both Intel and organizations today and 3 to 4 years from now?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I talked about sort of that Linux, which is sort of a very commodity software. But let me go back to the previous question for a second.
Yeah.
You also talked about the free element of it. I think an important element to understand is open source is not like free beer. It's like a free puppy. So exactly. You got to nurture it, you got to curate it, you got to feed it, you got to take it for a walk, you got to play with it, and you need to spend time with it. And that's where, investing in the open source software and how do we make it accessible to the developers is we think about the flywheel, where Intel is making contributions in the upstream project. Then we are working with our partners to integrate those software into the downstream distribution and then make it accessible to the customer. So let me take an example of OpenJDK, for example. When I come deep from the Java background and I work with that team very closely. So we make all the optimizations in OpenJDK, which is the upstream version, because all the downstream distribution, whether it's Amazon Corretto, Oracle JDK, Eclipse, Adaptium, pick your favorite, they all pick it up from the upstream version. They take that, and that's what the customers use. And then the customers tell us that, this is the feature that I would like to see more. We work with a large range of customers, and that flywheel is what continues to feed our innovation in the open source community. So now let's go back to the question, Arun, that you asked. I think over the next 3-4 years is going to be, there are a lot of trends that we are seeing. First of all, WebAssembly is definitely a hot topic, that we are seeing rising for our customers, just because of the potential that it provides. How short of a footprint that it can provide, how it can make things very easily accessible in the web, how it can make things faster on an edge. So there are a lot of different ways people are thinking about leveraging WebAssembly. And within Intel, of course, we are part of the Bytecode Alliance, and other places where WebAssembly standards are happening. There was a WASMCon that happened, I believe, a couple of weeks ago. There's a person at Intel by the name Ming Chiu. He was one of the co-chairs. So we are deeply involved in that. And that's an area where the investment is definitely growing. The other trend that is really shaking the world today is AI. And AI is very much central to what Intel has been or is doing essentially across the board. And really, Intel's strategy around AI is to bring AI everywhere. And that's sort of what we are working on. And I kind of talked about, for example, how Intel is a top 3 contributor to PyTorch. We just joined the PyTorch Foundation as a governing board member. Well, joined as in we got nominated and elected to be the PyTorch governing board member. We are part of the LF AI and Data Foundation more recently as well. And there are other fun things that we are doing that we'll talk about a little bit later in the podcast as well. We are very committed to addressing this challenge with a broad, as I talked about, software-defined, silicon-accelerated approach that is truly grounded in openness, choice, trust, and security. And I think that's another element that we are seeing. So cloud native continues to be a theme for a lot of the customers as they're getting into the modernization journey. That how do we get into that journey? How can I run? I was talking to a customer this morning and they were telling me, Arun, how can I run, how can I get a multi-tenant VM running on an Intel architecture where I could run lots of small containers with very small VMs and CPU allocations? So those are the challenges that are not just in software, but also we are going to think of it from the hardware perspective, that how we're going to challenge ourselves to be serving the needs of our customers over the next few years.
Yeah. Joe, I want to ask you kind of a different, maybe a little more business-centric question. We've seen for years, people are, enterprise architects and people have to make, sort of big, longer-term decisions about, what they invest in from a hardware perspective, because they're trying to plan for, what might be coming from a software perspective down the road for their business, some new initiative or whatever. I have to imagine AI is sort of putting you in a similar situation in which you've got these capabilities, these teams from a software perspective that, can in theory move fairly quickly. You're working with communities, so you've got kind of force multipliers of people, and then you're probably working with your counterparts that are building hardware, which take very long periods of time. They don't, like you said, they 5, 6, 7 years to tape things out and build. And how do you have those conversations, across Intel where you've got really fast moving trends like AI right now, where it's on the tip of everybody's tongue, what comes out tomorrow is different than, and then try and pair that to, how do you get the future into the, without having a crystal ball, how do you get that into the hardware life cycles and the timing they have? Like, how do you balance that sort of fast and longer term type of thing, especially with AI being at the center of that conversation today?
It turns out that's actually a much better. It's almost it's a bridge question. If I was from the trends discussion that you just gave, Arun, I think there's trends of things that we're driving and trying to contribute into in the industry, and then there's the trends that the industry is taking on themselves. A couple of years ago, Hennessy and Patterson had a very, very famous paper where they talked about workload optimized silicon evolving to be able to handle some key challenges, and AI is a great example of that, where you can do this. The math on deep learning is actually pretty predictable. It's the math itself isn't so complicated, but it's insanely parallel, and you can build very, very optimized silicon for a problem like that. But the challenge when you do that is you've built an accelerator, and it's domain specific, and it's not general. And so one of the other trends that can happen in the industry is that, along with this, the Turing Award winners paper saying that you're going to have a Cambrian explosion of microarchitectures, each one of them could come with their own proprietary, closed, vendor-specific programming model. And that may sound great if you've got a problem and you want to program it once and get it done, but what happens when you want to change? What happens if another approach comes out that's good, or another piece of silicon wants to replace it, or heaven help you, you get locked into a supply chain problem where you've only got one vendor. And so that the thing that's happened in the industry that Arun's talking about with Java and other things is abstraction, and the ability to create portable applications across different form factors, domains, microarchitectures. And so I think that the thing that we have to take a look at is to put those things together and talk about the reality that application-specific and optimized silicon's coming, and you need some layer of abstraction that keeps people open and gets to the, I think Arun's used words like openness, choice, and trust, and 4 or 5 different times in the meeting. How do you do that?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is that something that we I don't know if you guys caught the Linux Foundation's announcement about a week ago. Something called the Unified Accelerator Foundation, or UXL, I believe they go by with the and what that is taking the kind of the lower levels of the software stack. If in AI you have a framework, or you have an application above a framework, or the thing, if you wanted to do the framework developer wanted to program in something that can get at accelerators, or you wanted to do a custom kernel, you're either going to write in Intel's language and vendor A, vendor B, vendor N, whatever, all of our different languages, or we can try to find a lingua franca that is vendor independent, that is well known, that is based on open standards like C++, that has standardized library and other interfaces, and try to put that out there and create not a competitor of ours could go and put their own optimized library underneath it, but at least all the interfaces are open and standard. And we started that with a vision of oneAPI about 4 years ago, and the idea was good enough that we were approached by a number of other companies who said that they liked the approach, wanted to take a look at adopting it, but they wanted to make sure that they had the things that the open software community has embraced, like open governance. And so I think what we end up doing is we can't predict the future. We can't predict every one of the different silicon optimizations we're going to build, but we don't want to also force people to write, get locked into a walled garden of a single vendor, or a single microarchitecture, or a single way of thinking, by themselves. And so we proposed originally oneAPI, now the UXF, as a mechanism that allows us to be able to innovate and scale. If you think about it, I've got a SYCL program. I'm calling on a series of libraries, and the way I'm going to lower that down through standards like the SPIR-V standard, and then eventually through LLVM down to the hardware, uses all open standards at every layer, and gives software developers, open developers, the ability to program in abstraction, or almost to the metal through some standard mechanism. And it allows me to innovate and deliver very, very different microarchitectures or hardware, and avoid the idea of chaining ourselves into one of our microarchitectures, or a developer into one of our chips, or anyone else's. So we really tried to think that through a lot of years ago, and that's something we've spent a lot of time and effort on over the last 4 years, which is kind of enabling that choice and openness for the future.
Fantastic. Well, we're kind of at time here, so I'm going to ask both of you. Arun, maybe you want to start, and then Joe, if you want to finish. Any kind of closing thoughts on the future, and maybe what to expect from Intel in the future?
Absolutely. I'm super excited and super pumped about how our roadmap looks like over the years now. And I think I would summarize how Pat said that at Innovation last week, that the execution machine is back. Intel has known to be that reliable company that delivers. And with Pat and Greg at the helm, I'm super excited how that execution machinery is coming back and building that predictable delivery. And while they mainly talk about sort of the hardware part of it, but again, it's software defined, hardware enabled. And we're working very much in lockstep to make sure open source, open ecosystem is the way that we're going to make it successful, not just for us, but for our customers as well.
Oh, cheapers, Arun, you pretty much took what I would have said. So let me wing it. One of the other things that's happened, I don't think people understand about Intel, while the execution machine is back, is that I think the Intel you're going to see for the next decade and longer is slightly different than the one you may have seen for the last 30 or 40 years. Intel grew up under something we call, integrated device manufacturing, or IDM. We build our fabs, we build our processors, and we try to enable an ecosystem through having a great fab and a great product. When Pat returned to Intel a couple of years ago, he talked about something called IDM 2.0, and that's one where Intel may build products in other people's fabs, and we may use our fabs, and in fact, we hope to, plan to, make them available to others, including our competitors. And that changes Intel from a product company that's just trying to get you to absorb our transistors through us into an ecosystem company where you compete, you cooperate, you work together in entirely new ways. And I think that should be really intuitive to the open source development environment where people are working, competing, collaborating, competition, it all exists, but it's going to be embedded in the DNA of the Intel that you'll be working with for the next decade. And it may not be the one that you envision or have seen for the last several decades.
Good stuff. Good stuff. It's not your father's Intel anymore, although it worked very, very well in the past. So no, excited to see the changes. We obviously followed Pat quite a bit while he was at VMware. I had a chance to meet him a number of times. So excited to have him back. Excited to see the ecosystem both on the chip side as well as obviously, as we talked about today, on the software side, really exploding. And to me, I think the biggest thing is having a better understanding of what Intel does to make, like you said, so many things possible for people that, while it might be behind the scenes, is really, really important. And whether you're directly involved with it or indirectly involved, it does makes things a lot easier for a lot of us. So Joe and Arun, thank you so much for the time tonight. Great to reconnect with the Intel team. Great to sort of see where you guys are thinking about the bigger picture of stuff, and excited to see where Intel's going next. So Aaron, with that, why don't we wrap it up? Thank our guest, take us home, and we will thank you folks for the time today.
Yep, absolutely. So everyone out there, first of all, thank you so much for listening. And of course, as always, if you enjoy the show, please tell a friend, please leave us a review. And if you have feedback, we certainly welcome it, and also ideas for guests at any time. On behalf of Brian and myself, again, thank you for listening this week, and we will talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.